I live in Salt Lake City and I've been doing freelance landscape photography for about 4 years now, ever since I quit my job at an insurance company and decided that slow death by spreadsheet was not how I wanted to spend my 30s. The photography doesn't pay like the insurance job paid. It pays enough, which is a different and better thing, and more importantly, it means I spend most of my weekends out in the Utah backcountry with a camera instead of in a cubicle watching the clock. My name is Casey Drummond. I'm 31 years old. I drive a 10-year-old RAV4 with Colorado plates that I haven't gotten around to changing and a crack in the windshield that I keep saying I'll fix and won't until it becomes a safety issue. The back seats are permanently folded down to fit my gear. I have a cat named Aperture who expresses her feelings about my travel schedule through strategic property destruction. Last month it was a house plant, the month before that, a phone charger. I've accepted that this is the cost of doing business with her. I am by any reasonable measure an ordinary person. I take pictures of rocks for a living. I drink too much coffee. I have strong opinions about lens filters. I'm bad at returning texts from people who aren't clients. Normal. Unremarkable. The kind of person that things do not happen to. I want to establish that clearly before I tell you what I found 3 weeks ago in the Canyon Country, south of the San Rafael Swell. Because what I found is not the kind of thing that happens to ordinary people, and I need you to understand that I was going in exactly that. I drove down on a Thursday evening after a week of editing work that had kept me stuck inside too long. The San Rafael Swell is one of those parts of Utah that doesn't get the national park crowds, but has this raw, almost violent geological beauty that I find more interesting than the polished tourist destinations. The formations out there come in every shade of red and rust and ochre, and in certain morning light the stone looks almost liquid, like it's still in motion on time scales too slow for human perception. I'd been wanting to shoot it for 2 years and kept finding excuses to put it off. Finally, I just packed the car on a Thursday night and drove south. I was going alone. I do most of my backcountry shoots alone. I work better without managing someone else's energy, and the people I know well enough to invite on a 4-hour drive to the desert are mostly the kind of people who start complaining about the heat before they've finished unloading the car. Solitude suits me. I've done solo backcountry trips in conditions considerably more demanding than a warm October weekend in the high desert. I know how to read terrain. I know how to navigate. I know what I'm doing out there. Friday and Saturday were exceptional. Incredible light formations I hadn't seen photographed. I filled 2 memory cards with work I was genuinely excited about. I camped at a designated site Friday night, ate a terrible freeze-dried backpacker meal that claimed to be Thai peanut noodles, slept better than I do at home. Saturday, I ranged further east than I'd planned, following a canyon system that kept opening into wider and more complex chambers the further in I went. The geology in that part of the swell is insane. You'll turn a corner and find yourself standing in a room of stone, 200 feet tall and barely wide enough to spread your arms with the sky reduced to a ribbon of blue directly overhead. I could have spent a month in there and not covered the same ground twice. Saturday evening, I drove back to camp. Sunday, I was going to pack up and head home. Instead, Sunday morning, I went back. This is what happens when you're shooting somewhere extraordinary and the light keeps being extraordinary and your photographer brain keeps whispering just one more corner, just one more turn. You almost had it yesterday. But if you go a little further, you'll get it today. I've lost entire days to this. I've missed flights, missed dinners, missed appointments of varying importance. It's not a character flaw so much as a feature of how I'm wired, and on this particular Sunday morning it drove me back to the Eastern Canyon system with full batteries, 3 fresh memory cards, and no particular plan to stop before I'd found whatever it was I felt like I hadn't quite gotten yet. I was maybe 3 miles in when I found the section I hadn't reached the day before, a narrow passage between 2 walls of deep red Wingate sandstone that dropped about 15 feet to a lower ledge system. The descent was straightforward. I've done worse scrambles with heavier gear. On the lower ledge, shooting southeast, I found what I think might be the best single frame I've ever taken. 3 successive natural arches in perfect alignment, the morning sun cutting through all 3 simultaneously, the light broken into 3 separate columns of deep gold falling on the canyon floor below. I worked it for probably 20 minutes, adjusting my position by inches, trying different exposures, completely absorbed. This is the trance state that makes the work good and makes me occasionally terrible to spend time with. The universe contracts to the frame and everything else stops existing. I didn't notice my water bottle slide off my pack until I heard the sound of it bouncing. It cascaded down the rock face behind me, struck something part-way down with a hollow ring, bounced again and disappeared over a ledge about 30 feet below my position. I heard it land. The sound it made landing was metallic, not the flat crack of bottle on stone. The ring of something hollow, something structural. I turned around. I looked down. Below the ledge, mostly hidden by a rock overhang that would render it invisible from the canyon trail or from the level above, was a seam. A perfectly rectangular seam in the face of the sandstone. The rock around it was stained dark with rust, bleeding outward from the frame, years and years of oxidation spreading into the porous stone. Set into the seam, flush with the cut face of the rock, was a steel frame, and in the steel frame a door, not a natural feature, not erosion, not fracture. A manufactured door deliberately installed, deliberately concealed. I am a photographer. My first thought, genuinely embarrassingly, my first thought was that I needed to document this before I touched anything. My second thought was that I needed to get down there. The hatch was set into a section of sandstone that had been cut flat. The kind of precise flat cut that requires equipment you don't bring on a backpacking trip. The steel frame was recessed slightly into the cut face so that the hatch sat flush with the surrounding rock rather than protruding from it. The overhang above it was positioned to throw shadow across the frame at most sun angles. From the main canyon trail, from any approach that didn't involve scrambling down to this specific lower ledge, you would never see it. Whoever installed this had spent real time thinking about concealment. I shot 40 frames before I touched the handle. the rust staining the rectangular seam the way decades of weathering had worked the steel into the surrounding rock palette. Then I shot the handle itself a simple industrial pull bar, heavy gauge steel, the kind you find on cold storage doors. The handle was dark with fresh lubricant, not old oil residue, fresh, applied recently enough that the surface was still slick when I touched it, not yet dusty, not yet oxidized. Someone had been down here recently enough that the maintenance was fresh. I stood there with my hand on the oiled handle of a concealed hatch in the middle of the Utah Canyon backcountry, and I had a very clear thought. This is a thing you should not open. I opened it. The hatch swung outward on smooth, recently maintained hinges, and cold air came up. Not the cool of a shallow cave or a shaded overhang, the sustained chemical cold of a sealed enclosed space that has been at a consistent temperature for decades. It smelled of antiseptic and dust, and something I couldn't immediately name, something organic and stale. The headlamp beam dropped down a concrete shaft with steel ladder rungs set into one wall. I took the Nikon off my shoulder and put it around my neck. I left my pack on the ledge. I took my headlamp, my phone, my folding knife, and whatever it is that makes people climb down ladders into dark shafts when they know perfectly well they shouldn't. I grabbed the top rung and went down. The shaft was deep. The square of sky above me shrank as I descended from notebook-sized to playing card-sized to something I could cover with my palm. The air got colder with each meter, and the smell intensified, layering the antiseptic note over something older and more organic over something else beneath. That's something I would only understand much later. My feet hit concrete and I let go of the ladder. The headlamp beam on full power, rated to 40 meters, swept the space and found nothing. No far wall, no ceiling beyond the I-beam grid directly above me. I was standing in a room so large that my light couldn't reach its boundaries. The ceiling was 15 feet up, supported by a regular grid of steel I-beams that disappeared in every direction. The floor was polished concrete, cracked now by decades of frost heave and thermal cycling, but the original surface had been laid smooth and flat by people who had put engineering thought into it. To my right, a workstation. Metal desk, heavy gauge, institutional furniture from a specific era, thick, functional, built to last and not designed to be beautiful. On the desk, a Rolodex open to the S's, a rotary telephone, a coffee mug with a cartoon Roadrunner on it, and the words, beep, beep, in a blocky 1970s typeface. A stapler with a name sticker, property of D. Kessler. A blank memo pad with the pen still clipped to the cover. A small framed photograph facing away from me that I turned around to reveal two people at what appeared to be a company picnic, the colors slightly oversaturated in the way of photographs from that era, both people squinting into sun that had been going down for 46 years. Face down beside the coffee mug, a calendar. I turned it over. The last visible date was October 14th, 1978. I stood in the cold dark of this room that had been sealed and waiting since before I was born, and I felt something settle over me that I've since spent 3 weeks trying to describe accurately. It wasn't fear exactly, not yet. It was the specific feeling of a place where time stopped involuntarily, not the orderly closure of a decommissioned building, no removal of personal effects, no forwarding of mail, no checklist. The Rolodex was open at a random page. The game of solitaire I found 3 desks over was mid-hand. The sweater draped over the chair back at the 5th workstation still held the shape of someone's shoulders. These things said the people who sat here did not decide to leave. Something else decided for them. I raised the Nikon and started shooting. The workspace was enormous. Dozens of workstations spread across the floor in clusters open plan in the way of 1970s office design, the desks grouped in 4s and 8s around shared central spaces. Walking through it in the moving circle of my headlamp felt like archaeology. Each cluster was a small excavation of someone's daily life from 46 years ago. A mug collection on one desk, 7 different novelty mugs, including one that read, "World's Okayest Engineer." A hanging plant holder at another station, the hook still in the I-beam above it, the plant long since gone to dust, and leaving only the dried ghost of its soil in the ceramic pot. A corkboard at one station with papers still pinned to it, a meeting schedule for the week of October 10th to 14th, 1978, a birthday card signed by many hands, a newspaper clipping about the upcoming midterm elections. The walls I found by walking the perimeter, my headlamp sweeping. Large format topographic maps of the surrounding canyon country, USGS survey quality, but marked up heavily in colored, pen-numbered locations coded, designations, lines, and boundaries. I couldn't decode. One map had a dense cluster of red marks several miles east of what I estimated was my current position. Another had overlapping circles in green pen, exposure radius, projected dispersion, pattern, optimal positioning at 1.2 megatons, surface burst. Between 2 of the maps, a poster. Large format, professionally printed, faded but legible. 3 block letters arranged in a triangle above a stylized mountain silhouette. Below the logo in the confident sans serif of 1970s corporate identity design, Genetic Resilience Solutions. And below that, centered in slightly smaller type, Preparing Humanity for What Comes Next. I stood in front of the poster and photographed it, and thought about the phrase and what it might mean in a facility this size, hidden this carefully in the canyon country of southern Utah, sealed in 1978 and never decommissioned. At the far end of the workspace, double doors, industrial steel with a push bar. I went through them, and the headlamp beam swung down the longest corridor I have ever stood in. 40 meters of light range, and I could not find the far end. The ceiling was 10 feet up the walls, roughly 6 feet apart, and lining both walls for the entire visible length of the passage doors. Heavy steel doors, each with a viewing port at eye level. A slot approximately 2 inches by 6, covered with thick plexiglass. Each door had a number stenciled in white paint. First on the left, 001-GRS. First on the right, 002-GRS. The sequence ran down the hall and into the darkness. I moved my headlamp across the nearest doors and counted the numbers were sequential, no gaps. I walked far enough to see 047-GRS on my left, before the end of the corridor was still not in sight. Most of the doors had heavy hasp-style locks on them. The locks were closed, some were not. I stopped and stood very still. There was a smell in this corridor that hadn't been present in the workspace. Organic and compound and wrong alive in a way that the workspace, for all its preserved ordinariness, had not been. The smell of something biological in an enclosed space that hadn't had adequate ventilation in a very long time. I breathed it and tried to categorize it, and my brain offered me several options, and then offered me a composite that was worse than any of the individual components. I walked to door 001-GRS. I raised my headlamp to the viewing slot. I looked. The chamber was 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide. The walls were bare concrete, stained in patterns that I would later understand were the marks of long habitation, a high water mark of biological accumulation on the lower walls, darker patches where something had repeatedly pressed against the surface. The floor was bare concrete. In the far corner on the floor was a shape. I stared at it. My brain tried to process it and kept cycling back to start. It was human-shaped in the way that a word can be human-shaped. It had the right general proportions, the right number of limbs, a head, a torso. But the limbs were wrong in every specific. They had lengthened beyond any normal human range, and they had additional articulation joints where the long bones of the forearm and thigh should have been unbroken. Bends that allowed configurations no human skeleton could achieve. The skin was the pale color of something that had not been in sunlight for decades, translucent enough that a dark vascular network was visible beneath it, branching and rebranching in patterns that had been growing without interruption since whatever was done to this person was done to them. The hair was gone. The head was turned toward the corner wall, the face not visible. It shifted. A slow, barely perceptible redistribution of weight, the movement not of something sleeping, but of something that had been motionless long enough that motion had become rare and deliberate. Something twitching at the edge of its own awareness. I stepped back fast. My heel caught a crack in the floor, and I went down on my left elbow, and the impact pain shot up my arm and cut through the dissociation and put me back in my body. I was on the concrete floor of an underground corridor. There was something alive in the cell in front of me. There were at least 47 cells. I was alone. From somewhere down the corridor, far and distance unclear, came a sound. Dragging, rhythmic, heavy. Something being moved across concrete in measured, effortful strokes. Getting closer. I stood up. I moved. I am going to try to describe what I saw in the next few doors accurately, because I think accurate description matters here. I think vague is worse than specific. I think you need to understand what genetic resilience solutions produced in that corridor before I explain what GRS was and what they were trying to do, because the explanation requires the context of the outcome, and the outcome is not something that summaries do justice to. Door 003-GRS unlocked. I looked because my headlamp caught the slot as I passed, and I looked before I could stop myself. The chamber had a substance on the walls, dark, wet-looking, moving. Not dripping, not falling under gravity, but moving upward against gravity, coating the concrete in a slow, creeping layer that reflected my headlamp beam in oily, iridescent flickers. Blues and greens in the oily surface, like a thin film of gasoline on water, but slower, more deliberate. I watched it for 4 seconds before I realized that the floor was also covered and also moving, and that the two surfaces were meeting somewhere in the middle, and I looked away and kept walking. Door 008-JRS locked, but the occupant was at the plexiglass when I passed. Something pressed against the slot from the inside with a force that left an impression. The plexiglass was slightly bowed outward, had been bowed repeatedly, the plastic showing stress fractures at the edges. What pressed against it was a face, or the geography of a face, the correct number of features in approximately the correct regions, but each feature wrong in its own specific way. 2 eyes at different heights and different sizes, the larger one filling almost a quarter of the available facial area, the smaller one barely the size of a thumbnail. Both of them moving independently of each other, oriented at slightly different angles, as though perceiving different things simultaneously. A nose that had migrated downward and widened, reshaping itself into something more functional for a different kind of breathing. A mouth that was too wide, reaching from below one eye to below the other, and too full of teeth, arranged not in the standard human arc, but in 2 concentric rings, the inner ring smaller and finer, the outer ring larger and set at a slight inward angle, the whole face pale, the whole face watching. It hit the plexiglass when my light touched it, and the impact rang through the door and down the corridor, and the dragging behind me got louder, and I ran. The corridor went on and on. I ran past numbered doors, and my headlamp strobed them as I passed, and I caught what I caught, a hand at a viewing slot with too many fingers, each joint doubled, pressed against the plexiglass in a gesture that looked almost imploring. A room where the floor was covered in small white objects, scattered wall to wall, that my running brain required 2 full strides to identify as teeth. Hundreds of human teeth, covering the concrete like dropped change. A door where something had partially forced its way through the viewing slot and stuck there, one elongated arm extended into the corridor, the hand at the end of it opening and closing, in the cold air, feeling blindly for something to grip. As I ran past it, the fingers brushed my jacket and I felt the contact through the fabric and ran faster. The dragging sound was behind me and gaining. I didn't turn to look. I focused on the end of the corridor which kept not arriving, which kept being further than the headlamp could reach, until suddenly it was there. Another set of double doors, push-bar industrial steel, and I hit them at full speed. The lab was large and cold and clinical. Stainless steel benchtops running the length of the space in parallel rows, glass-fronted cabinets mounted on the walls, containing row after row of labeled vials, centrifuges, and microscopes and equipment I could only partially identify. The ceiling was higher here, maybe 20 feet, with ventilation ducting running along its length. Refrigeration units built into one wall, most of them dark and silent, a few still showing the faint amber of standby indicator lights that had been burning for 46 years. The floor had a drain grid running down its center, and around the drain the concrete was stained in a pattern that told a clear story about what this room had been used for. I catalogued this detail and moved on from it immediately. The doors on the far wall were locked. I hit the push bar and felt the magnetic lock hold. Hit it again harder. Same result. I stood with my shoulder aching and my heart beating at a rate that was going to cause problems if I didn't get it under control, and I listened for the dragging sound. Close. Very close. The doors behind me, the ones I'd come through, had swung mostly closed after I burst through them. Not fully. I could see a sliver of the corridor through the gap. I turned off the headlamp. Complete darkness. The standby lights of the refrigeration units provided barely enough ambient glow to confirm I was still standing. I pressed against the locked doors and breathed very carefully and heard the doors behind me push open. The dragging entered the room. An irregular rhythm, drag and rest, the movement of something compensating for a body that didn't work as intended. Under it, secondary sounds, something wet, something that caught and released with each cycle of movement. The refrigeration units hummed. My own heartbeat was too loud. The dragging moved across the lab floor. It passed maybe 8 feet to my right, moving toward the far end of the space. I heard it pass a bench top, and something shifted on the steel surface. Something pushed aside a soft collision of laboratory equipment. Then the sound moved further away and diminished. I counted 60 seconds, counted them carefully. Then I turned the headlamp back on. The lab was empty of visible movement. On the far bench top, something had been disturbed. A centrifuge sat on the floor below the edge. A glass cabinet door hung open. On the floor between my position and the entry doors, a trail dark, wet, parallel lines with smeared material between them, the track of something dragged across clean concrete. I turned back to the locked doors and was trying to figure out my options when the voice came from the ceiling speaker, and I nearly fell over. "You shouldn't be here." Crackling, distorted, filtered through a speaker system that hadn't been fully maintained in decades. But the voice itself was present tense, current, responding to me now in this room. Male, old, the thin, precise quality of someone who had trained himself to speak carefully, to use exactly the words he meant, and no others. Slightly hoarse, the voice of a person who had not had a conversation in a very long time, and whose vocal cords showed it. I stood completely still. "Are you injured?" "Who are you?" I said. "My name is Wendell Kessler. I have been the facility director here since 1974. A pause. "I'm sorry you found this place. I'm going to help you get out safely, but I need you to listen to me." D. Kessler, the stapler on the desk in the workspace 46 years ago. "What is this facility?" I said. "Genetic Resilience Solutions. We were a private research organization contracted by several federal agencies beginning in 1971. Our mandate was biological hardening, developing methods to make human subjects more resistant to ionizing radiation from nuclear exchange. The Soviet nuclear program in the early 1970s made an exchange seem statistically probable within our working lifetimes. We were tasked with ensuring that some portion of the human population could survive the aftermath. "The things in the cells," I said. "Those are people. Those were people, volunteers and clients. The protocol produced uncontrolled results in a significant percentage of subjects. The genetic modifications did not stabilize at the intended parameters. They kept changing. Yes, the modification cascade, once initiated, continued beyond the designed scope. Different in each subject. The expression was not predictable and not bounded by the parameters we had set. "How many people?" I said. A pause. The original client and volunteer pool was 237 individuals across the facility's active period. Not all of them experienced adverse modification. Approximately 60% showed the full phenotypic expression you've seen. The remainder showed partial or minimal expression and were eventually released, returned to their lives. Another pause. "We don't know fully what became of them." I stood in the cold, dark lab and processed that. 60% of 237 people, 142 approximately, who had become what I'd seen in those cells, and 60 or 70 more who had been released into the world with partial modifications, told to go home, go back to their lives, and the facility had simply not tracked what happened to them afterward. "Where are you?" I said. "Operational level, above you. I can guide you to me and then to a surface exit. There are 3 viable exit points, but you need to follow my directions exactly. The subjects have ranges throughout the lower levels, and I need to route you carefully. Why should I follow your directions?" The pause that followed had weight. "Because I've been down here for 46 years, and I know where everything is," he said. "And because the subject you heard in the lab space is not the only one currently active in this section." "How do I know you're going to lead me out and not just to somewhere useful to you?" "You don't," he said, "but consider your alternatives." The locked doors clicked. An electronic release, a heavy thunk of a magnetic lock disengaging. I pushed, and they swung open. "Stairway down 1 level, then straight through to the next set of doors," he said, quickly. The stairway went down, which was wrong. I wanted up, and my instincts argued with me the entire descent. But the space at the bottom was lit with the amber glow of the dome before I reached the doors, and when I pushed through them, I stopped completely and forgot every other concern for a full 5 seconds. A street. An actual street approximately 200 meters long, paved with a synthetic rubber compound that approximated asphalt in color and texture, but absorbed footsteps differently, too quiet, slightly giving. On either side of the street, single-story ranch houses in the style of a 1970s American subdivision. 12 of them, 6 per side, set back behind small front yards of artificial grass that had faded from whatever green it had originally been to a uniform pale near white. The yards had decorative rocks, plastic flowers, small front porches with outdoor furniture. The houses had numbers on the doors, mailboxes on short posts, screen doors. The ceiling was a dome painted. Blue and white gradients suggesting sky, the technique skilled enough to be convincing in the right light, but slightly even too smooth, lacking the texture of actual weather. At the dome's center, a large circular fixture designed to simulate sunlight, currently dim, set to what amounted to perpetual amber twilight. On the walls beyond the houses where the dome met the floor, large murals of mountain ranges and tree lines a painted horizon distance. Someone had built an entire suburban street underground. Someone had built a subdivision in the Utah Canyon country and sealed it 46 years ago and never opened it again. Beneath the fake grass and the painted sky and the plastic flowers, the smell, blood and decay and biological processes that no amount of domestic simulation could mask, not overpowering present, settled in. The smell of something that had been here for decades. Center of the road, Kessler said from a speaker mounted above the nearest front porch. His voice here came from everywhere, from all 12 houses, simultaneously, each porch speaker carrying the same feed. Stay in the open space. Don't approach the houses. What are they doing in there? I said. Living, he said, as they can. I started walking. The amber twilight created shadows at the margins of the houses along the walls behind the mailboxes. I watched the shadows. Most of them held still. The one in the yard of the third house on the left did not. It detached from the shadow along the house wall and moved into the yard low fast, reorganizing its limbs as it moved in a way that suggested neither the gait of a person nor the gait of any animal I knew. Something that had worked out its own relationship to locomotion. It crossed the artificial grass to the yard boundary and stopped. At the edge where the fake grass met the rubber road, it paused and raised its head. The face was inverted, not figuratively, literally. The mouth was above the eyes, the features transposed so completely that my visual processing required 2 full seconds to decode what I was looking at. The mouth was open, the teeth, visible 2 rows of them, curving inward. The eyes were below the mouth near the jawline, and they were both fixed on me with an attention that was fully present and fully deliberate, not confused, not animal, aware. It did not cross onto the road. I kept walking. I kept my headlamp forward and my gaze on the center line of the road, and I kept walking. The second generation is different from the first, Kessler said from the nearest house speaker as I passed it. More stable, more coherent. The phenotypic drift seems to have reached a kind of equilibrium in the subsequent cohort. There are children down here, I said. Adults now. Some of them were born here and have never been to the surface. Others were born in the first few years after the facility was sealed, when some of the first-generation subjects were still in a state of transition. A pause. There are approximately 30 individuals on this level. The population fluctuates. Some have died over the years. Some have been born. From behind the 6th house on the right came a sound I can only describe as a filing cabinet being dragged across a concrete floor, a deep rhythmic scraping with harmonics in the wrong frequency range for any biological source I could identify. I did not turn toward it. I maintained my pace and kept my eyes forward. From the window of the eighth house, a face. Pressed against the glass, the features distributed according to a logic I couldn't map onto any standard human anatomy. Eyes of dramatically different sizes, one normal one filling nearly a quarter of the face, both oriented at slightly different angles, seeing different things or seeing the same thing from two different points of reception. The mouth was closed. It was watching me move down the road with the patient, tracking attention of something that has learned to observe. I did not stop. I did not look away. I kept walking. The end of the street. Behind the last house on the left, slightly less pale than the others in the amber light, marginally more blue, I found the access hatch to the level above. A ladder going up a concrete shaft, the same as the one I'd come down. I grabbed the first rung without breaking stride. I came through a floor hatch into a space that was so different from everything below that the contrast was physically disorienting. Carpet. Green intact, recently vacuumed. A sofa against one wall, a coffee table with a small plant that had been watered. Recently the soil dark and moist. Bookshelves with actual books, their spines readable technical manuals, scientific journals from the 1970s through the 2010s, novels. Actual novels, paperbacks, the kind you'd find in an airport bookstore with current publication dates on the spines. A reading lamp, warm, light, functional. A kitchen alcove with a countertop and a functioning refrigerator, its compressor humming the sound of it. The most normal sound I had heard since climbing down the access shaft. Fluorescent lights overhead, most of them working. A whiteboard on one wall covered in what appeared to be ongoing calculations. A computer monitor showing a grid of camera feeds, most dark, several live. At a desk in the corner, an old man. He was 83, somewhere in that range, thin, with the specific economy of a very old man who has been careful about his health for decades and cannot do anything about time. White-haired, precisely dressed button-up shirt, tucked slacks with a crease, the kind of clothing you wear when you have decided that standards matter regardless of circumstances. A pen in his right hand, papers on the desk beside a laptop with the current operating system visible on the screen. He had been down here for 46 years, and he had a current laptop and a recently watered plant, and the carpet had been vacuumed. These details landed in me in sequence, and each one added to a picture that was coherent and disturbing. In a very specific way, this was not a man who had given up. This was a man who had decided in 1978, or shortly after that, this was his life now and had proceeded to live it as fully as the circumstances allowed. He raised his eyes from the desk when I came through the hatch and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Not surprise. He'd been watching me on the cameras since I came down the access shaft. He knew exactly who I was and what I looked like and what I'd been through. The expression was something more complicated than surprise. Something like seeing a thing you had hoped for but not allowed yourself to fully expect. "Casey Drummond," he said. "Salt Lake City. You drove a RAV4 with Colorado plates." He gestured toward the monitor. "The facility cameras have been tracking you since the access shaft. Some of the coverage has gaps, but I've been watching you work." He paused. Your compositional choices in the workspace were very considered, the way you documented before disturbing anything. Wendell Kessler, I said. Yes, he set the pen down. Please sit down. You're injured and you've been through a significant amount in the past. He checked his watch, approximately 4.5 hours. I looked at my left arm, a gash along the outside of the forearm, 4 inches shallow but bleeding freely. I hadn't noticed when it happened. Somewhere in the corridor run, something had caught me. I sat in the chair across from his desk. I didn't take my eyes off him. Tell me what this place is, I said. All of it. Not the version from the promotional materials. He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at me. Genetic Resilience Solutions was founded in 1971 by 3 researchers from different fields, myself in genetics, a molecular biologist named Greta Vandermeer, and a physicist named Calvin Oser, who had worked on the nuclear program and understood radiation biology from the inside. The original concept was straightforward if nuclear exchange was coming, and in 1971, the probability models suggested it was someone needed to develop a human population that could survive the aftermath. Not just survive immediate exposure, but survive the long-term environmental contamination, the multi-generational radiation effects, the collapse of normal food chains. We wanted to build radiation-resistant people by experimenting on them, I said, by modifying them with their consent. Extensively documented consent with full disclosure of the experimental nature of the protocol. He paused. Or what we represented as full disclosure. We disclosed what we knew. We didn't know enough. What was the modification? Gene therapy. Extremely advanced for 1972, which is when we began the theoretical work. We were working with mechanisms that weren't fully characterized in the scientific literature for another 20 years. We had made discoveries, genuine discoveries, about heritable genetic modification and the expression of introduced sequences. He picked up his pen and put it down again. The protocol was designed to introduce a suite of modifications that would alter cellular response to ionizing radiation, essentially pre-adapting the subject's genome to conditions of high radiation exposure. We modeled it extensively. The models said it would work. It didn't work. It worked. That's the it worked. The radiation resistance we intended was achieved. Every subject who underwent the full protocol and survived the immediate modification period showed measurable and significant resistance to ionizing radiation. He paused. The problem was that the modification didn't stop. The introduced sequences continued to express beyond the intended parameters. The modifications we had designed were stable in the short term. Weeks, months, the duration of our testing. Over years, they continued to propagate. The phenotypic expression we saw in the early cohort, the changes you observed in those cells, began appearing 18 months to 2 years after modification. Progressive, ongoing. Different in each subject. Did you know it was happening? We knew some subjects were showing unexpected secondary expression within the first year. We thought it was manageable. We thought we could develop a stabilizing protocol. We kept working. We kept taking clients. His voice was very level, very controlled. We kept taking clients for approximately 2 years after we knew something was wrong, because the facility had overhead. Because our government contracts required deliverables, because we had 300 people on a waiting list who believed we were their best chance of survival in a nuclear war that seemed inevitable. He looked at the wall, and because we genuinely believed we were close to a solution, but you weren't. In October of 1978, the rate of phenotypic expression accelerated significantly across the first-generation cohort. Subjects who had been showing slow progressive changes began changing rapidly. The facility could no longer be managed safely by the staff we had. We had 23 employees at that point. The decision to evacuate was made at a level above mine by the government agencies who funded us. 20 employees left over a 48-hour period. 3 stayed, myself, a nurse named Helen Park, who stayed to continue caring for subjects she had worked with for years, and a maintenance technician named Ray Alvarez. He stopped. What happened to them? Helen died in 1991. A subject she had been working with closely, one she considered more stable than the others, had a rapid expression event. She was in the cell when it happened. His voice didn't change, the level control of someone who has processed a grief that is 46 years old. Ray left in 1985. He decided to go. I understood. I've never blamed him. He had a family. He had children he had never seen. A pause. I drove him to the surface exit and said goodbye and came back down. Why did you come back? I said. In 1985, with Ray leaving, why didn't you just go? He was quiet for a long moment. The refrigerator hummed. From below us through the floor, nothing the facility was silent. Because of them, he said finally. The subjects, the people in those cells. They had families who never knew what happened to them. They had paid us, trusted us, believed in what we told them. Some of them had brought their children. Some of them had done it for their children, the logic being that a child who underwent modification young enough would have a different relationship to the changes, would adapt better. Several of the second generation were modified as children. He looked at his hands. I cannot leave them here alone and die. That's all. I cannot do that. So I haven't. I sat across from him and looked at this 83-year-old man who had spent 46 years underground, maintaining a facility full of the consequences of his work, and I tried to locate the appropriate feeling for the situation, and kept finding several feelings simultaneously, none of them adequate. You wanted me to come up here, I said. You could have guided me straight to an exit from the lab level. Why did you want to see me? He reached into the desk drawer and removed a folder. Thick the edges, dark with age, a rubber band around it that had degraded and stuck to the cardboard cover. He set it on the desk. He set a USB drive on top of it. The complete research archive, he said. The protocol documentation the subject records 46 years of observational data on both generations. The genetic sequencing work, the financial records, the contracts with the government agencies, with the internal communications that show exactly who knew what and when. He paused. I've spent 46 years maintaining records because records are the only thing that makes events real to people who weren't there. When I'm gone and I'm 83, which means I'm going, the records need to exist somewhere else. What do you want me to do with them? What you think is right, he said. I've lost the perspective to know what that is. I've been down here too long. I'm too close to all of it. But you came down the ladder, you moved through the facility with attention and care, and you're still thinking. That's rarer than you'd think. I've seen a few people find the access shaft over the years. Most ran immediately. One made it to the corridor before the subjects alarmed. You made it all the way through to me. He looked at me steadily. I trust your judgment. What about them? I said. I gestured downward, meaning the street, the houses, the 30 people who had never seen daylight. What happens to them? That's the question I've been unable to answer for 46 years, he said. They can't go to the surface. The second generation especially, they have no reference for the world above, no language for it, no preparation for it. The first generation retains some human cognitive framework, but their physical forms make surface existence impossible. They need this facility. He looked at the wall. They need someone to maintain this facility, and I'm 83. He didn't say the rest of it out loud. He didn't need to. I picked up the folder. I picked up the USB drive. I put them inside my jacket. The exit, I said. He pointed to the door on the left wall. Stairs up passage to the right, hatch at the end. It's unlocked. He paused. I unlocked it this morning. I had a feeling about today. I stood. I looked at him for a moment. There are other facilities, I said. On the maps in the archive room, 4 total. Yes, he said. Different programs, different protocols, different organizations. I had no contact with them after 1978. I don't know what became of them. I'm going to find out, I said. He nodded. Not surprised, not grateful, exactly, something more complex. I know, he said. I went to the door on the left. Casey, he said. I stopped. The voicemail message I'm about to tell you the location of is self-destructing in 3 years, he said. There's a phone number, it's in the documentation. It reaches a secure line that I check weekly. If you need to reach me before I'm no longer reachable, use that number. I looked at him. 83 years old, button-up shirt, recently vacuumed carpet, living proof that a person can decide how to inhabit an impossible situation if they decide carefully enough. Okay, I said. I opened the door and started climbing. The stairs were concrete and narrow, and they went up a long way further than felt right, further than the geometry of the space I'd been moving through should have allowed. The passage at the top was low-ceilinged and smelled of cold stone. I followed it right as Kessler said, and found the hatch at the end, steel horizontal, a simple bar latch unlocked. I pushed. Dead leaves and small stones fell away and cold canyon air poured in, and I pulled myself through onto a ledge of sandstone and lay on my back and looked at the sky. Late afternoon. The light was going long and gold, the canyon walls on either side, deepening from amber to rust, to something close to burgundy in the early shadows. The shadows were clean and specific, the exactly right quality of canyon light that I had driven 4 hours to shoot. Above me, Two ravens worked the thermals in slow ascending spirals, calling back and forth with the conversational cadence they use when the evening is going normally and nothing is wrong. Everything was entirely normal. The canyon was exactly what it had been when I descended. The light was moving across the stone in the way light moves across stone when nothing else is happening. The ravens were doing what ravens do. 80 feet below me in the rock, 46 years of consequences were still in progress. The street with its 12 fake houses. 30 people in various states of becoming something they had not chosen to become. An 83-year-old man at a desk maintaining records, keeping the systems running, waiting for someone to figure out the next step. I lay on the sandstone until my breathing was normal. Then I sat up, took the Nikon from around my neck, checked the memory cards, the documentation from the workspace, and the corridor was there. I had stopped shooting when the running started. Partial, not comprehensive, not enough on its own for anything official. Inside my jacket, the folder and the USB drive. I stood and shouldered my pack from where I'd left it on the lower ledge and started the long hike back. The walk was 2.5 hours. Normal hiking problems, tired legs, a cut arm that stung, and had clotted navigating by headlamp for the last 40 minutes over terrain I'd covered in daylight going the other direction. The GPS track from the morning was clear, and I followed it back without incident. My RAV-4 was in the pull-off where I'd left it. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and the folder and the USB drive on the passenger seat and looked at them in the dark for a long time. The dashboard clock said 9:17 p.m. I had been underground for approximately 8 hours. I drove back to camp, made coffee, sat in my camp chair in the dark and drank it and looked at the stars, the actual stars, the ones that are there when you're 60 miles from a city, the overwhelming density of them that makes the sky look like something is behind it. And I tried to think. It's been 3 weeks. I'm home. Aperture has been making her feelings known about my extended absence in the standard ways. I've edited the Friday and Saturday photographs, which are genuinely excellent, and sent a batch to 3 clients. I've been to the coffee shop every morning and the grocery store twice, and the hardware store once for a new shelf bracket. Normal life, entirely normal surface. The folder is in a fireproof box in my closet. I've read every page of it. The protocol documentation, the subject records, Kessler's 46 years of observational logs, written in the same neat handwriting, getting slightly less steady with each passing decade. The financial records, the government contracts, the internal communications from the agencies whose names I'm not going to reproduce here, not yet with the memos that document exactly who was told what about the facility closure, and when they were told it, and what their responses were. The names in those memos are not obscure. Some of them are names that appear in history books. Some of them are names that appear in current contexts, held by people who inherited the legacy of the people who signed those memos, who may or may not know what they inherited. I've had a researcher friend look at portions of the genetic sequencing data without context. She told me it represented work that was decades ahead of its time in several specific areas. She asked where I found it. I told her an incomplete truth and she let it go. I've made 4 copies of everything and they're in 4 different locations. The phone number Kessler gave me is in my phone under a name that doesn't mean anything to anyone who might look at it. I've used it twice, brief calls confirming the facility systems are stable, confirming he's stable. His voice sounds the same as it did face to face. Precise, careful, slightly hoarse. The voice of a man who has made his peace with a very long wait. What I do next, I'm still working out. There are people who need to know what's in those documents. Specific people in specific positions with the specific authority to do something that doesn't end in a government cover-up or a military operation or any of the outcomes that would be easiest for the people whose names are in those memos. Finding those people and getting the information to them in a way that actually changes something rather than just disappearing into a classified file somewhere, that's the work. I'm not equipped for it by training or profession. I'm a freelance photographer from Salt Lake City. But Kessler waited 46 years for someone to come down that ladder, and I was the one who came down, and that means it's mine to figure out. One more thing, because it's in the documents, and I think about it every day. GRS had 4 facilities, 3 in the western United States, 1 overseas in a location I'm not specifying with coordinates I've written down and not shared. The western facilities had documented closure procedures, however inadequate and cruel, beginning in 1978. The overseas facility has no closure documentation in the archive, no evacuation records, no communications after 1977, just the coordinates and a project code and a notation that reads Site 4 Independent Operational Protocol. No oversight required. I don't know what that means. I don't know what happened there. I don't know if Kessler knows or if anyone knows. But I know where it is, and I'm going to find out. If you're hiking in the canyon country, south of the San Rafael Swell, if you're out there with a camera or a backpack, or just the specific restlessness that drives people into the backcountry on a Sunday morning, and you drop something off a ledge and hear it hit metal, leave it where it fell. Walk back out the way you came. Drive home. Make coffee. Hold your cat. Call someone you've been meaning to call. Some things the canyon keeps for a reason. And some reasons are things you cannot carry once you know them. I know them now. I'm carrying them.